think can sneak into my office and spy on me? I checked the security footage. Who sent you? Corpu! Answer me!
Jack Diode doesn't exist. I made him up so I could see with my own eyes what you've done to my wife's restaurant.
The rain started at 4 in the morning. Roy Callahan didn't mind rain. He minded silence more. He was 64 years old, built like a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life. Gray beard trimmed short, forearms like rope, a scar above his left eyebrow nobody asked about anymore. He stood in his garage in Millport, Ohio. A 78 shovel head sat up on the lift, half torn apart, oil pan off. Gasket in his hand. This was where Roy did his thinking, not in an office, not behind a desk, in a garage, with grease under his nails, at 4 in the morning, when the rest of the world was still asleep. Before any of this, there'd been the Army. Roy enlisted at 19, the same year his father lost the family hardware store to a bank that didn't care how long the Callahans had lived in Millport. He didn't join for glory. He joined because the recruiter's office was warm and the house wasn't, and because a paycheck was a paycheck. He ended up in the Gulf in 1990, part of the buildup before Desert Storm kicked off. Nobody back home understood what that war looked like. It wasn't long, not compared to other wars. But it was loud, and it was fast, and it left its mark on a man in ways that didn't always show on the outside. Roy came home in the spring of 1991, 29 years old. Steadier hands than most men his age. A quieter mouth too. He didn't talk about the war much. Still didn't all these years later. What he carried from it wasn't stories. It was a way of seeing things, a habit of noticing who was telling the truth and who was performing. He'd learned over there that character shows up clearest under pressure, not on easy days. He'd also carried home a friend's dog tags, a promise made to that friend's mother that he'd live a life worth the one her son didn't get to live. He figured he'd kept that promise, mostly. Some days he wasn't so sure. He met Ellen a couple years later at a diner counter in a different town. She was a waitress working doubles to put herself through nursing school. He was a construction worker still finding his feet, ordering black coffee he could barely afford, just to sit somewhere warm and talk to somebody kind. She used to say he fell in love with her apple pie before he fell in love with her. Roy never argued the point too hard. Both things were probably true. They married 18 months later, in a church that only sat 60 people. Half his motorcycle brothers stood outside because there wasn't room. Engines lined up along the curb like an honor guard nobody had asked for. 5 years after that, Ellen came to him with an idea. A little diner of their own. Nothing fancy. Just honest food and a warm room for people who didn't always have somewhere warm to sit. She'd saved $11,000 from nursing shifts. Roy added what he had, $200, if you want the exact truth of it, was what was left in their account after the down payment on the building. They built that first location with their own hands. Nights and weekends, while Roy still worked construction during the day. Ellen picked the paint colors. Roy built the booths. They hung the open sign together on a cold morning in March and cried a little, both of them, though neither ever admitted it to the other for years. That was the Millport location. The one still standing 2 blocks from where Roy now sat, rain hammering the garage roof, 14 restaurants now. Dalton's Diner, they were called, named for Ellen, Dalton being her maiden name, because Roy figured if he was going to put a name on something, it should be hers. Ellen had been gone 8 years. Cancer took her slow. 6 months. He'd sat with her every night in that hospital room, holding her hand, and she'd made him promise one thing before she went. Don't let the first one go, Roy. Whatever happens, that diner is where we started. Keep it, he'd promised. His phone rang. 11 at night on the display, though it felt later. He looked at the number, unknown. He almost didn't answer. Then he did, Callahan, silence on the other end, breathing. Then a voice, low, disguised somehow, like the caller was speaking through a cloth. Something's wrong at the Millport location. Real wrong. You need to see it yourself. Don't send someone. Come yourself. The line went dead. Roy stood there in the garage, gasket still in his hand, rain hammering the tin roof above him. The Millport location, his first one, the one Ellen had bled her savings into, the one with her name still on the sign out front. He set the gasket down. That restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a marriage. It was a promise. And someone was telling him it was in trouble. He thought about calling his son-in-law Richard. Richard ran operations now, good with numbers. married to Roy's daughter, Sarah, for 6 years. But something in that anonymous voice told him not to call anybody yet. Because here's a thing Roy had learned in 40 years of running a business, and 40 years before that in the Army. People lie to your face when you're the boss. Everybody smiles. Everybody says things are fine. The books look clean because somebody made sure they looked clean. But nobody lies to the dishwasher. Nobody performs for the man scraping plates in the back. Roy walked into his house, quiet inside. Sarah had moved out years ago. It was just him and the ticking of an old clock in the hallway, one that hadn't worked right in 8 years, frozen at 4:15 in the afternoon. The exact time Ellen had passed, he'd never fixed it. Didn't feel right fixing it. Some things you leave broken on purpose. It reminds you. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looked at himself a long moment. Then he got the razor. He shaved the beard down to stubble. Cut his hair shorter, rougher, the way a man might cut it himself with clippers in a garage, not a barber shop. He put on an old flannel shirt with a tear in the sleeve. Work boots scuffed at the toe. He took off his wedding ring, held it in his palm a second. Then he slid it into his shirt pocket, over his heart next to something else he always carried. 2 dog tags on a chain, not his own. They'd belonged to a man named Frank Delgado, who didn't come home from the Gulf in 1991. Roy had carried those tags for 35 years. He looked in the mirror one more time. A stranger looked back, older, rougher. A man who might wash dishes for $11 an hour and nobody would think twice. "All right, Ellen," he said quietly to the empty house. "Let's go see what they've done to our place." He grabbed his jacket and walked out to the garage. Didn't take the shovel head, too recognizable, half the town knew that bike. He took the old pickup truck instead, the one with a dent in the tailgate and Ohio plates so faded you could barely read them. He drove through the rain toward Millport. 30 minutes down old Route 9, past the fields, past a water tower with his own initials half faded on the side. From a Long Ago town council vote, he'd talked down to just his initials, because a man shouldn't get too proud of himself. Driving those 30 minutes, Roy found his mind drifting back to the early years of the business, the way it always did on long stretches of quiet road. He remembered the first health inspector who'd walked through Millport, clipboard in hand, expecting to find corners cut on a shoestring budget. Instead, the man had found a kitchen cleaner than half the chain restaurants in the county because Ellen wouldn't allow anything less. And Roy had built the whole place around whatever standard she set. He remembered, too, the winter their furnace went out, 3 months after opening, and how they'd kept the doors open anyway, running space heaters borrowed from half the neighbors on the block, because closing even for a week felt like admitting the whole idea had been a mistake. Regulars had shown up, bundled in coats, laughing about it, ordering hot soup just to warm their hands on the bowl. That was the kind of loyalty a place earned when it treated people right from the very beginning. Roy wondered, driving through the rain now, how much of that loyalty still existed inside these walls, and how much of it Curtis had quietly worn away without anybody higher up ever noticing. He parked 2 blocks from the diner, sat in the truck a minute, watched the lights inside. Through the window, he could see the dinner rush winding down, servers moving fast, a young woman, couldn't have been more than 26, carrying a tray of dishes, and a man in a white manager's shirt standing too close to her, jaw tight, saying something Roy didn't need to hear to understand. He'd seen that posture before, in the Army, in restaurants, in life. A man using his position to make someone smaller. He thought briefly about the men he used to lead. A good sergeant never trusted a report from the field. He walked the line himself, looked soldiers in the eye, found out for himself what was true. Running a restaurant chain wasn't the Army. But some lessons didn't care what uniform a man was wearing when he learned them. 72 hours. That's what he had before the board meeting in Columbus, where Richard and the rest of the executive committee would vote on whether to sell off the underperforming locations. Millport was on that list. First on that list, 72 hours to save the one thing Ellen asked him never to let go. Roy got out of the truck and walked toward the back entrance, the one marked MP employees only, rain running off his collar, and for the first time in 8 years, he felt something close to purpose. The kitchen door was propped open with a milk crate. Steam rolled out into the cold night air, smelling like fryer grease and dish soap. Roy knocked twice on the frame. A young man in an apron looked up from a mountain of dirty pots. "We're closing in 20 minutes. Man, not here to eat," Roy said. "Hear about the dishwasher job. Saw the sign in the window." The kid shrugged. "Talk to Curtis. He's the manager." "Office is back there." Roy walked through the kitchen slow, taking it in without looking like he was taking it in. That was a skill from the army, too. How to read a room without anybody noticing you were reading it. The kitchen was in rougher shape than it should have been. Stove hood needed cleaning bad, grease built up thick along the edges, a walk-in cooler with a door that didn't seal right, letting cold air leak into the hallway. Inventory boxes stacked wrong, some expired stock sitting right out where anybody could see it, if anybody bothered to look. This wasn't a kitchen falling apart from neglect. This was a kitchen somebody was actively running into the ground. He found the office, door open. A man sat behind a desk that used to be Roy's own desk, years back, before the company grew big enough to need something bigger. Curtis Boone. Roy recognized the name from paperwork, though he'd never met the man face to face. Corporate had hired him 2 years back to manage Millport while Roy focused on the bigger locations in Columbus and Cincinnati. Curtis was maybe 40. Slicked hair, an expensive watch that didn't match a diner manager's salary, and the kind of smile that showed up a half-second too late, like a man reminding himself to use it. "Help you?" Curtis said, not looking up from his phone. "Hear about the dishwasher position." Curtis looked him over, slow, the way you'd size up a used car you already decided not to buy. "You're a little old for dish duty, aren't you, pal?" "Man's gotta eat," Roy said. "Doesn't matter how old he is," Curtis smirked, made a note on a clipboard without really asking any questions. 11 an hour. You start tomorrow, 6 a.m., you're late twice, you're gone. Simple as that. What's your name? Roy had thought about this on the drive over. He needed a name close enough to his own that he wouldn't slip up, but different enough that nobody would connect it. "Jack," he said. "Jack Doyle." Curtis wrote it down without glancing at an ID. Didn't ask for references, didn't ask about work history, just wanted a body in the kitchen by 6 a.m. "You got a problem with authority, Jack?" Curtis asked, still not making real eye contact. "Some of these older guys we bring on, they think they know better than management. Causes friction. No problem with authority," Roy said, "long as it's earned." Something flickered behind Curtis's eyes at that, like he wasn't sure if he'd just been complimented or measured and found wanting. He let the thought go. "Fine. 6 a.m. Don't be late." He waved a hand toward the door, already back on his phone, done with the conversation before it had properly started. Roy noticed something else in that office. A framed photograph on the wall, corporate headshots of the executive team, the kind every location was required to display. Roy's own photo sat in that frame too, from 3 years back, clean-shaven, suit and tie, a man who barely resembled the one standing in this office now. Curtis had glanced at that photograph exactly 0 times during the whole conversation. Hadn't recognized the face, hadn't made the connection. That told Roy 2 things at once. A manager who couldn't be bothered to know his own company's leadership by sight was a manager who'd stopped caring about accountability a long time ago. And a man who doesn't check references, doesn't ask for an ID, doesn't even glance at a photo hanging on his own wall. That's not carelessness. That's a man desperate enough for warm bodies that he'll take whoever walks through the door and trust them to stay quiet about whatever they see. "See you at 6, Curtis said, not looking up. Roy walked back out through the kitchen. This time he caught the eye of an older man standing at the flat-top grill, gray hair under a hairnet, forearms marked with old burn scars, the kind you only get from decades of cooking. The man looked at Roy a half-second too long. Something in his face shifted. Not recognition exactly, more like a flicker, a question forming behind his eyes. Roy kept walking, didn't break stride. Didn't give the man anything to work with, but he filed it away. That cook had looked at him like he almost knew him. He'd have to be careful. Roy showed up at 5:40 the next morning. Wanted to be early. A man who shows up early gets to watch a kitchen wake up, and a kitchen waking up tells you more truth than a kitchen already running. The gray-haired cook was already there, prepping vegetables, moving with the kind of economy only decades in a kitchen teaches you. "You're the new dish guy," the cook said, not looking up. "That's right, Otis." He stuck out a hand, calloused, strong grip. "Otis Grant." "Been cooking here 9 years, Jack," Roy said, shaking his hand. Otis held the handshake a second longer than it needed to last. Looked at Roy's face again, that same flicker from the night before. Then he let it go and turned back to his vegetables. "Curtis will have you on pots and pans, mostly," Otis said. "Maybe prep if we're short. Don't talk back to him. Don't ask questions in front of customers. Keep your head down and your mouth shut, you'll be fine." Sounds like good advice for a lot of jobs. Otis almost smiled at that. Almost. The morning went the way mornings go in a diner kitchen. Deliveries. Prep work. The low hum of grills warming up. Roy scrubbed pots at a sink station in the back corner, out of the way, exactly where a new dishwasher should be. He watched everything. He watched the delivery driver bring in produce, and watched Curtis sign the invoice without checking a single box against what actually got unloaded. He watched a case of chicken thighs go missing somewhere between the truck and the walk-in, nobody saying a word. He watched the register through the pass-through window, watched a young server, the same one from the night before, ring up a table's order, then watched Curtis walk past and adjust something on the screen without her noticing. Her name tag read Nora. Around 11, the lunch rush hit hard. Roy fell into rhythm, scrubbing plates, stacking them, keeping the line moving so the cooks never ran out of clean dishes. It was hard work, good work, the kind that makes a man's back ache by 2 in the afternoon but leaves his mind clear. He liked it, honestly. There was something clean about it, no decisions to make, no board meetings, just dirty plates and hot water and the satisfaction of a stack of clean dishes growing taller. Around noon, an elderly couple came in and sat in booth 4. The same booth, Roy realized with a small jolt, where he and Ellen used to sit on Sunday mornings before the diner got too busy for them to sit anywhere at all. The old man ordered the meatloaf special. The old woman ordered soup and asked, gently, if the coffee was fresh. A young server named Patty waited on them, knew enough that she still smiled like the job hadn't worn her down yet. Roy watched from the sink as she brought the coffee and watched the old man's face light up at the first sip, the way a regular's face lights up when something familiar tastes exactly the way he remembers it. That was the whole point of this place, Roy thought. Not fancy food. Familiar comfort. A room where an old couple could sit in the same booth for 20 years and trust the coffee would taste the same every single time. Somebody in this building had forgotten that. Roy remembered, standing at his sink, the exact conversation where he and Ellen first talked about what they wanted this place to be. Not the biggest menu, not the fastest service. Just somewhere a person could sit down, be treated decently, and leave feeling a little better than when they walked in. It sounded simple, back then, over coffee at their kitchen table. It had taken years to build into something real, and apparently only a season or 2 of neglect to start unraveling. At 1 o'clock, during a rare lull, Otis wandered over with 2 cups of coffee and set one down beside Roy without a word. "You don't have to do that," Roy said. "Didn't say I had to." Otis leaned against the counter, watching the kitchen door. "You're quiet for a new guy. Most folks talk your ear off first day, nervous energy. You just watch, old habit, military?" Roy glanced up. "What makes you say that? The way you stand. Feet apart, weight balanced. The way your eyes move around a room before your head does." Otis sipped his coffee. Had a brother in the army. "Recognized the posture." Roy said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Don't worry," Otis said. "Not my business. Man's got a right to keep his own history to himself." He glanced toward the front of the house, where Nora was refilling coffee for a table of retirees, smiling the way service work demands you smile, even on your worst day. "Just watch out for that one, would you? She's had a rough couple years. Doesn't need anybody else piling on. What happened to her?" Otis considered how much to say to a man he'd known less than a day. Husband was National Guard. Died in a training accident 3 years back. Left her with medical bills and a father-in-law who can't really live alone anymore. She works doubles most weeks, never complains. Never asks for help either, which is its own kind of stubborn. "Sounds like a good woman. Best one in this building," Otis said. "Which is exactly why it turns my stomach, watching Curtis use her like a punching bag every time corporate asks him hard questions he can't answer honestly." He pushed off the counter and went back to his station before Roy could ask anything more. Around 3, Curtis stormed into the kitchen, face red, phone in hand. "Nora, get back here." She came in fast, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes? Table 6's bill is short $11. You comped a dessert without authorization. The woman's card declined twice. She was embarrassed. You just cost this restaurant money out of your own stupidity. That's what you just did." Curtis's voice climbed loud enough that the whole kitchen went still. "I've told you 3 times. You do not comp anything without my sign-off. Are you deaf or just careless? I'm sorry. I'll cover it out of my tips." "Damn right you will." Curtis turned and stalked off, muttering something about hiring smarter people next time. Nora stood there a second, jaw tight, eyes wet but refusing to spill over. She grabbed a silverware rack and walked back out to the floor, spine straight, like a woman who'd learned to keep walking no matter what had just happened to her. Roy watched her go. Something tightened in his chest. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. Something closer to recognition. Because Roy Callahan had built 14 restaurants on one simple rule, said out loud to every manager he'd ever hired. A rule that used to be painted on the wall of this very kitchen before somebody took it down. A good restaurant isn't the one with the best food. It's the one where nobody gets left alone in the kitchen. Somebody had taken that sign down. Somebody had forgotten what this place was built on. Otis caught Roy's eye across the kitchen. Didn't say a word, just gave a small shake of his head, like he was saying, "I know, I see it too. And there's nothing either of us can do about it." Yet Roy went back to his sink. Scrubbed harder than he needed to, 71 hours left. By the end of week 1, Roy had a rhythm going. Clocked in at 5:40 every morning. Clocked out around 3 or 4. Went back to a cheap motel room off the highway, rented under the name Jack Doyle. And every night he wrote down what he'd seen, not on a laptop, in a notebook, the old kind. Because a notebook doesn't sync to the cloud, and a notebook doesn't get hacked. The picture forming wasn't good inerty, disappeared faster than any restaurant this size should burn through product. Deliveries got signed off without proper checks. The walk-in cooler ran 4 degrees warmer than it should, which meant spoilage, which meant wasted product, or worse, product served that shouldn't have been served. Roy sat on the edge of the motel bed one night, notebook open on his knee, doing the kind of math he used to do in the army when supplies didn't add up to the manifest. Back then, missing supplies sometimes meant a man wasn't coming home with what he needed. Here, the stakes were smaller, but the instinct to chase down the discrepancy felt exactly the same. The gap between what corporate records showed being delivered and what the kitchen actually had on hand bothered him. Not because it was catastrophic, because it was consistent. Somebody wasn't stealing in a panic. Somebody had built a quiet, steady leak, designed to look like ordinary waste if nobody ever added 3 months together at once. That took patience. That took a mind that understood exactly how thin a margin needed to stay to escape notice. Roy didn't think Curtis was smart enough to build a leak like that alone. Curtis was good at yelling, good at intimidating a scared 26-year-old into silence. But this kind of quiet, patient theft required a different kind of mind entirely, which meant somebody else was involved. Or somebody else was pulling strings Curtis didn't fully understand himself. And Curtis rode Nora harder than anybody else on staff. Roy started paying attention to why. It took him 3 days to understand. Nora was the only one who still checked the register totals against the receipt tape at the end of every shift. Old habit, maybe, or just a woman who liked things done right. Either way, she was the only employee in the building who might notice numbers not adding up, which made her a problem for somebody. Roy thought about how easy it would be, in a business this size, to bury one honest person's diligence under enough paperwork that nobody upstairs ever noticed the pattern. Corporate reviewed hundreds of line items across 14 locations every quarter. A single manager, quietly shading numbers over months instead of days, could hide almost anything inside that volume, so long as no one on the ground ever pushed back. Nora had pushed back, quietly, without meaning to make trouble, just by doing her job the way she'd always done it. That alone had apparently been enough to put a target on her. One evening after close, Roy stayed late under the excuse of a deep clean on the pot sink, something Curtis was happy to let him do unpaid since Roy hadn't complained about it. Once the building emptied, he slipped into the small back office where the physical ledgers were kept. The paper backups corporate required every location to maintain. In case the digital system ever failed an audit, he'd have maybe 20 minutes before the night janitor arrived. He flipped through 3 months of records fast, the way a man reads who's spent a lifetime reading paperwork nobody else wanted to read. The numbers told a story. Comped meals, well above industry standard. Spoilage write-offs on inventory that matched suspiciously well with deliveries that had gone strangely light. Cash register discrepancies logged under Nora's shift number more often than any other employee's, even though her actual register drawer, when Roy discreetly checked a till record from 2 nights back, had balanced perfectly. Somebody was building a paper trail, and that trail pointed straight at Nora. Roy heard footsteps in the hallway. He closed the ledger fast, slid it back exactly where he'd found it, and busied himself wiping a shelf when Otis walked in. "You're not supposed to be back here," Otis said quietly. Looking for a mop, Otis studied him a long moment, then closed the office door behind himself. "Soft, careful Jack Doyle," Otis said. "That's not your name." Roy didn't answer. "I've cooked with a lot of men in my life," Otis said. "Don't forget faces easy, and I sure don't forget the face of a man whose picture used to hang right there." He pointed to a blank rectangle on the wall, unfaded paint where a framed photo had clearly hung for years before somebody took it down. "Opening day photo, you and your wife cutting a ribbon out front." Curtis took it down about a year back, called it outdated branding. Roy exhaled slow. "You gonna say something?" Otis shook his head. Not my business why a man wants to walk his own kitchen in disguise. But I'll tell you this much, since you're clearly here looking for trouble. He nodded toward the drawer Roy had just closed. Trouble already found this place. Been building for a year. And that girl out there, Nora, she's about to take the fall for it, unless somebody with real power notices before Curtis finishes setting her up. Why her? Why not somebody else? Because she's the only one who still checks the numbers. Because her husband died 3 years ago. So she's got nobody to fight for her but herself. And because Curtis knows a woman raising her father-in-law alone, working 2 jobs just to keep his medical bills paid, isn't going to have the energy or the lawyer money to fight back once they pin something on her, Roy felt something cold settle in his gut. Her father-in-law lives with her. Old vet. Like you, I'd guess by that look in your eyes. Can't work anymore, bad hips, needs help getting around. She takes care of him same as she'd take care of her own daddy. Good woman. Doesn't deserve what's coming. Roy stood there a long moment thinking about Ellen, thinking about promises, thinking about a sign that used to hang on this wall. What's coming exactly? My guess, Otis said. Curtis needs a scapegoat before corporate looks too close at these numbers. Pin it on Nora, fire her clean, case closed. Nobody looks past her. Man protects himself by sacrificing somebody who can't fight back. You know this for certain? No, Otis admitted. But I've been cooking in kitchens 40 years. I know what it smells like when somebody's about to get thrown under the bus. And this kitchen's been smelling like that for a month. Roy nodded slowly. Thank you, Otis. Don't thank me yet, Otis said, turning to leave. Thank me if you actually do something about it. He paused at the door, hand on the frame. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why now? You own 14 of these places. Why put on an apron and scrub pots to figure out what a phone call to your accountant could have told you in an afternoon? Roy thought about that longer than he expected to. Because numbers lie when the right man's writing them, but people don't lie the same way in front of a dishwasher as they do in front of a boss. I needed to see it. Not read about it in a report, Otis nodded slowly, like the answer satisfied something in him. Your wife would have liked that answer. You knew her, met her twice. Community fundraiser years back. Had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room worth talking to. Otis allowed himself a small, tired smile. This place still smells like her cooking some mornings. Early, before the fryers get going. Swear I'm not imagining it. I don't think you are, Roy said quietly. Otis gave a final nod and walked out, leaving Roy alone with the blank rectangle on the wall, thinking about all the small ways a place can lose itself without anybody noticing the exact day it happened. Not one dramatic moment. Just a photo taken down here, a sign removed there, a manager who never checked deliveries, a habit that quietly became a policy. Until one day the restaurant Ellen built with her own hands didn't feel like hers anymore. Roy intended to find out exactly when that had started, and exactly who had let it happen. 68 hours left. The next afternoon the lunch rush ran long. A bus tour had stopped in, 40 extra covers nobody expected, and the kitchen scrambled to keep up. That morning, before the rush hit, Roy had watched Nora arrive early, tired circles under her eyes, arranging a home health aide over the phone in the parking lot to sit with her father-in-law for a few hours. Because her shift had gotten extended again without warning, she hung up, took a breath like a woman squaring her shoulders before a fight nobody else could see, and walked in smiling, ready to refill coffee and clear plates for strangers who'd never know what her morning had already cost her. Roy thought about Ellen again, watching her, about nights his wife came home from nursing shifts too tired to eat, but never too tired to ask about his day first. Good people carried more than anybody ever noticed. He worked the sink hard that morning, stacking clean plates faster than the servers could grab them, sweat soaking through his flannel shirt. Around 1:30, Curtis came storming through the kitchen with his phone in hand, face tight with a kind of nervous anger Roy recognized from men who knew they were about to get caught. Corporate had called. An unscheduled internal review moved up. Not in 72 hours anymore. Tomorrow morning, somebody at corporate, Roy would learn later it was his own assistant, following standing orders to escalate anything unusual, had flagged irregularities in the Millport financials and pulled the timeline forward without warning. Curtis needed his story locked in today. Not tomorrow, today. He marched straight to the dish station. You, he said, jabbing a finger at Roy. You've been in the back office. Otis said you had a mop excuse, but I checked the security footage from last night. You were in there almost 20 minutes. The kitchen went quiet. Even the fryers seemed to hush. Just cleaning, Roy said evenly. Bull, Curtis's voice climbed, the same voice he used on Nora, except sharper now, scared underneath it. You've been asking questions all week, watching everything. You're not some broke dishwasher, are you? Who sent you? Corporate send you down here to spy on me? Roy said nothing, just looked at him, calm, steady, the way he used to look at young soldiers panicking under pressure. The look that says, "Nothing you do right now scares me." That calm made Curtis angrier. "Answer me." The whole kitchen had stopped. Nora stood frozen by the pass window, a tray in her hands. Otis stood at the grill, spatula still, watching. "I'm just a dishwasher," Roy said quietly. "Doing my job." Curtis's hand moved before his brain caught up to it. The slap cracked across the kitchen. Loud, sudden, the kind of sound that stops time for half a second. Roy's head turned with the force of it. A red mark bloomed instantly on his cheek. Silence. Total silence. Even the exhaust fans seemed to quiet. Nora dropped her tray. Plates shattered on the tile. Otis took one step forward, then stopped himself because he already knew what was coming. And some part of him understood this wasn't his fight to finish. This was Roy's. Roy stood there a long moment, didn't touch his cheek, didn't raise his voice, didn't move at all. Then slow, deliberate, he reached into his shirt pocket, past the dog tags, past the wedding ring he'd carried there for a week, and pulled out a small leather badge holder, flipped it open. Inside sat his corporate identification card. Roy Callahan, founder and CEO, Dalton's Diner Holdings. Photo matching the face standing right in front of Curtis, minus a week's worth of beard growth and a haircut done with clippers in a garage. Curtis's face drained white. That's. His mouth opened and closed. "That's not your. Jack Doyle doesn't exist," Roy said, voice low and even, the voice of a man who'd once given orders in far worse rooms than this one. "Never did. I made him up so I could see what you've done to my wife's restaurant with my own 2 eyes, instead of trusting whatever report you'd have handed corporate tomorrow." Curtis stumbled back a step, bumping into the prep counter. "Mr. Callahan, I didn't know. If I'd known." "That's exactly the problem," Roy said. "You didn't know. Which means every kindness you've shown, every rule you've followed, every ounce of respect in this building only shows up when the boss is watching. That's not a restaurant, Curtis. That's a performance." The kitchen staff stood frozen, dish rags and spatulas hanging forgotten in their hands, watching a scene none of them could have imagined an hour ago. Roy looked past Curtis, at Nora, still standing amid the broken plates at her feet, eyes wide, hand pressed over her mouth. He looked at Otis, who gave him the smallest nod, like a man watching a promise finally get kept. Then Roy reached for his phone. "Get everyone into the dining room," he said. "All of you." Right now, nobody moved for a second. "Now," Roy said again, and this time his voice carried the same weight it must have carried 35 years ago, giving orders to men twice as scared as anyone standing in this kitchen right now. They moved. The staff filed out toward the empty dining room, aprons still on, confusion and fear thick in the air, nobody understanding yet what was about to happen, only understanding that the quiet dishwasher who'd scrubbed their pots all week had just become someone else entirely. Roy stood in the kitchen a moment longer, alone with Curtis, his cheek still stinging where the slap had landed. He thought of Ellen, of the sign that used to hang on this wall, of a promise made in a hospital room 8 years ago. He thought of the clock frozen at 4:15 and wondered, not for the first time, whether some things broken on purpose were finally ready to start moving again. 5 minutes, Roy said quietly, almost to himself. "Give it 5 minutes, Curtis. Then we'll see exactly what kind of restaurant you've been running while I wasn't looking." Curtis said nothing more. He simply stood there, color still drained from his face, as Roy turned from him and walked toward the swinging door, leaving him alone with whatever reckoning was already gathering on the other side of it. He walked toward the dining room, dog tags cold against his chest, the taste of something like grief and something like justice sitting side by side on his tongue. Behind him, the kitchen sat empty and silent, steam still rising off the grill, dirty plates still stacked in Roy's sink, waiting for hands that hadn't decided yet if they'd ever come back to finish the job. Outside, rain had started up again, soft this time, tapping the glass the same way it had tapped his garage roof the night before, when a stranger's voice on the phone first told him something was wrong. Roy paused at the swinging door, one hand flat against the wood, and allowed himself one private breath before walking into whatever came next. Somewhere in Columbus, Richard was probably still at his desk, unaware that the next 72 hours had just collapsed into something far more urgent. Somewhere in this building, Nora stood among broken plates, not yet knowing whether the day that started with humiliation might end with her name finally cleared. And somewhere behind Roy's ribs, in a place he rarely let himself visit, Ellen's voice repeated the same 6 words she'd made him promise in that hospital room years ago. Don't let the first one go, Roy. He hadn't let it go. Not yet, not today. But keeping a promise he was learning all over again sometimes cost more than a man expected to pay. And the bill for this one was only just arriving. Roy pushed through the swinging door, into the dining room, into whatever waited on the other side. The dining room had gone dead quiet. 14 employees stood in a loose half-circle between the booths, aprons still tied, hands still smelling like fryer grease and dish soap. Nobody sat, nobody spoke. They just watched the door, waiting for whatever was about to walk through it. Outside, rain kept falling steady against the windows. The same rain that had followed Roy since the night his phone rang in the garage. It felt, standing there, like the weather itself had been keeping pace with everything unfolding. Patient and unbothered, the way weather always is, regardless of what the people underneath it are going through. Roy pushed through the swinging kitchen door and stepped into the room. He didn't look like a CEO. Flannel shirt still damp with sweat. A red mark still fading on his cheek where Curtis's palm had landed. Work boots scuffed at the toe. If you'd passed him on the street, you'd have guessed retired mechanic, maybe a farmer in town for supplies. But something in the way he walked had changed. Shoulders back, chin level. The posture of a man who'd spent 35 years giving orders that mattered. He stopped in the center of the room, let his eyes move across every face, slow, deliberate, the way a commanding officer inspects a formation. He recognized most of them now, after a week of scrubbing dishes alongside them. Deshaun, who hummed old country songs under his breath while bussing tables. Patty, still young enough to smile through a double shift. An older cook named Ruth, who never said much but always left an extra biscuit for anyone who'd clearly had a hard morning. A young dishwasher named Tommy, who'd taught Roy, without ever knowing it, the fastest way to stack a drying rack. Good people. All of them, as far as he could tell. Caught up in something none of them had built, none of them had asked for, and most of them had simply been too afraid or too tired to fight. "My name is Roy Callahan," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room was quiet enough that a whisper would have carried to the back wall. Some of you might recognize that name from the sign out front. Most of you probably don't, and that's my fault, not yours. I built this restaurant 28 years ago with my wife Ellen. It was the first one. Before there were 14, there was just this. Nobody moved. I've spent the last week washing your dishes, Roy continued, under a different name. Watching how this place actually runs, not how a spreadsheet says it runs. And what I saw troubles me more than I can easily put into words. Curtis stood off to one side near the register, face still pale from the shock of it. He opened his mouth to speak. Roy raised one hand, not unkindly, just enough to stop him before he started. "You'll get your turn," Roy said. "Everyone will." He turned back to the group. "Now here's a piece of business I have to get out of the way first, and I want you to understand something before I say it. This isn't me. This is a clause written into every franchise agreement this company operates under, put there by lawyers. Years before I even knew half of you existed." He paused. Took a breath. "Any location under formal internal review, triggered by a documented incident involving physical altercation or suspected financial irregularity, requires an immediate suspension of the full shift roster, pending investigation." That review just got triggered. 5 minutes ago, in that kitchen, a murmur ran through the group. Someone near the back, a young line cook Roy hadn't spoken to yet, let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes out when a person doesn't know what else to do with fear. "What does that mean?" a voice asked. Nora's voice. Steady, but Roy could hear the strain underneath it, suspended. "Does that mean fired?" "It means suspended," Roy said, meeting her eyes directly. "Not fired. There's a difference, and I intend for that difference to matter." "For how long?" someone else asked. "That's the part I want every one of you to hear clearly," Roy said. "The clause gives corporate 72 hours to complete a review and issue final determinations. I am not going to use all 72 hours, and I am not going to let a piece of paper written by lawyers decide the fate of people I don't even know yet, without me looking at every single detail myself first." He looked at Curtis now, and something in his expression hardened. "Some of you did nothing wrong this week. Some of you may have done things that need answering for. I don't know which is which yet. That's exactly why I'm not signing anything final today. I need the truth first. All of it. And I intend to find it, one way or another, in the time I've got left." Nora's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her apron to still them. "What happens to us right now, today?" "Right now, you go home," Roy said. "Paid. Every one of you paid in full for the suspension period, whatever the outcome ends up being." That much I can guarantee you personally, and that has nothing to do with any clause. That landed differently than the suspension news had. A few shoulders eased down from around ears. A few employees exchanged glances, the tension shifting from panic toward cautious relief. But I need something from each of you in return, Roy continued. Total honesty. If any of you know something about how this location has been run the past year, anything that's felt wrong, anything you've been afraid to say out loud, I need to hear it, not to punish you for staying quiet before. People stay quiet for all kinds of reasons, and most of those reasons are understandable. I need to hear it now, because now is when it can still do some good. He let that sit a moment. A few employees exchanged glances, silently deciding whether they trusted this stranger enough to speak up, or whether it was safer to wait and see what happened first. That's all I've got for the moment. Go home. Rest. My team will be in touch about next steps within 24 hours. The group began to disperse, slow, uncertain, murmuring to each other in low voices. Some glanced back at Roy like they weren't sure whether to be afraid of him or grateful to him. Most seemed to land somewhere in between. A young busser named Deshawn lingered near the door, working up the nerve to say something, Mr. Callahan. For what it's worth, most of us tried to do right by this place. Curtis just made it hard some days, I believe you, Roy said. That's exactly why I'm not signing anything yet. Patty hung back too, twisting her apron strings in her hands. Is the restaurant closing? My mom keeps asking. She works 2 towns over, doesn't have benefits like this job. I need this job. This restaurant isn't closing, Roy said, and meant it, though he understood the promise carried more weight than she could know yet. Whatever else happens, that much I can tell you plainly. She let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the slap happened, thanked him twice, and finally left. Ruth, the older cook who never said much, paused at the door on her way out, looking back at Roy with an expression he couldn't quite place. 22 years I've been serving people in this town, she said. First time anybody who owned anything bothered coming down to see how the rest of us actually live. She didn't wait for a response, just nodded once and walked out into the rain. Her words stayed with Roy longer than he expected them to. Nora didn't move right away. She stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching Roy with an expression that looked less like anger and more like exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once. Roy walked over. Mrs. Reyes, he started. Whitfield, she corrected quietly. Nora Whitfield. Reyes was Curtis's mistake on my 3rd day here. Never bothered fixing it in the system, small thing. But it told Roy something about how carefully anybody had ever paid attention to this woman's file. Nora, he said, I need you to understand something. Whatever this review finds, I already know one thing for certain. You are not the reason this restaurant has problems. You don't know that, she said, voice tight. You've been here a week. I know character when I watch it under pressure for a week, Roy said. That's the one thing 35 years in this business taught me for certain. She studied as his face, like she was trying to decide whether to believe a stranger who'd just revealed himself to be her boss at Zavas's boss. A man who'd worn flannel and washed pots for $11 an hour just to see the truth with his own eyes. Go home, Roy said gently. Take care of your father-in-law. I'll be in touch. Her eyes widened slightly at that detail. Surprised he knew it, but she didn't ask how. She just nodded, gathered her coat, and walked out into the rain. Roy watched them all go, one by one, umbrellas popping open against the weather, cars pulling out of the gravel lot toward homes he knew nothing about, lives he'd never bothered learning the details of until this week forced him to look closer. 28 years he'd owned this place. He was only now, at 64, finally seeing the people who'd kept it running while he built 13 other locations further and further from home. Once the dining room emptied, only 3 people remained. Roy, Otis, and Curtis, still standing near the register, sweat beading at his hairline despite the kitchen's cool exhaust fans. Mr. Callahan, Curtis started, voice pitched somewhere between apologetic and desperate. I want you to know, everything I've done here I did to protect the numbers. Corporate wanted margins up. I found ways to get margins up. By writing off inventory that never actually spoiled, Roy said flatly. By flagging register discrepancies under an employee whose till balanced perfectly every night she worked. Curtis's face flickered, a half-second of genuine surprise breaking through the performance. He hadn't expected Roy to already know the specifics. I need my personal belongings from the office, Curtis finally muttered. Otis will accompany you, Roy said. Not because I don't trust you, because right now appearances matter, and I need this whole process to be clean. Curtis walked toward the office without another word, Otis following a few steps behind. A few minutes later, Curtis emerged carrying a small cardboard box, a coffee mug, a framed photo of himself shaking hands with a regional sales rep, a pair of sunglasses. At the door, Curtis paused and turned back. "You think you're better than me," he said, voice low, bitter. "Walking in here in some costume, judging everything I built? You didn't build anything, Curtis," Roy said evenly. "You inherited something someone else built, and you let it rot because rotting was easier than caring." Curtis's mouth worked like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. He turned and walked into the rain-soaked parking lot without looking back, box under one arm, shirt soaking through within seconds. Otis came back inside, shaking water from his jacket. "He'll be trouble," Otis said. "Man like that doesn't go quiet." "I know," Roy said. "Doesn't mean I get to skip doing this right just because it might get messy." Roy stood alone in the dining room a moment, rain streaking the front windows, the open sign glowing red against the gray afternoon, the same sign he and Ellen had hung together 28 years ago. He thought about how easy it would have been, over the years, to simply fold this location into the larger portfolio and let someone else worry about a small-town diner that barely moved the needle on quarterly earnings anymore. Plenty of other owners would have done exactly that, and nobody would have blamed them for it. But Ellen's name was on that sign, and some promises weren't meant to bend just because the math got complicated. Roy called Denise Ferris, corporate counsel, from booth 4 before he left the restaurant that evening. "Callahan," said a woman's voice on the other end, sharp as anyone Roy had ever worked with. She'd started as a paralegal, back when Roy still handled contracts himself at his kitchen table, and she'd never once let him cut a corner in the Wendecked since. "Denise, I need every internal review case file from the last 3 years. How many times the suspension clause got triggered, and what happened to the employees caught in it who turned out to be innocent." "That's a big ask on short notice, Roy, I know. I need it in 24 hours anyway." A pause on the line. "This about Millport? This is about making sure a good clause doesn't get used as a blunt instrument against people who don't deserve it," Roy said. "Get me that file, please. You sound different," Denise said. "Tired. Or something else." "Got slapped in my own kitchen 2 days ago," Roy said. "Puts a few things in perspective real fast." Denise let out a short, surprised laugh, then caught herself. "You're serious, dead serious. I'll explain everything once you're here." "On it," she said, and hung up. Roy sat in the booth a moment longer, thinking about Nora's face when she'd asked if suspended meant fired, and the fear underneath that steady voice. Something about the day still sat wrong in him, unfinished. Before returning to the ledger room with Otis, he drove out to the small rented house on the edge of town where Nora lived. He hadn't fully planned the visit. He simply found himself parked outside her driveway before he decided to make the trip. She answered the door cautiously, surprised to see him standing on her porch, rain jacket over the same flannel shirt, against the evening chill. "Mr. Callahan, is something wrong?" "No," Roy said. "Wanted to check on you myself." Man doesn't drop that kind of news on somebody and then disappear behind a phone screen for updates. She hesitated, then stepped back to let him in. The house was small, tidy despite clearly being run on a tight budget. A wheelchair ramp built along one side of the porch steps. A row of potted plants lined the porch railing, well cared for despite the season, the kind of small detail that told Roy somebody in this house still found time to tend to things that mattered even when everything else felt overwhelming. An older man sat in the front room in a recliner, oxygen tube looped over his ears, an Army veteran's cap resting on the side table beside him. Sharp eyes despite the frail body around them. "Dad," Nora said. "This is Mr. Callahan. He owns the restaurant." The old man studied Roy a long moment. "You're the one who caused all the commotion today." "I suppose I am," Roy admitted. "Good," the old man said, surprising them both. "Somebody needed to. That manager's been squeezing this girl for a year. I told her to quit twice. She wouldn't listen. Too stubborn, this one. Gets it from her husband's side, God rest him." "Dad," Nora said softly. "Part warning, part affection. What branch did you serve?" Roy asked, nodding toward the cap. "Army." "2 tours, different life entirely." The old man's eyes softened slightly. "You've got that same look. Seen enough to know quiet men mean business more than loud ones ever do." Roy allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Something like that." He didn't stay long. Just long enough to look Nora in the eye once more and repeat, plainly, that whatever the investigation found, her job and her reputation would be protected as far as it was within his power to protect them. Driving back toward the restaurant afterward, Roy found himself thinking about all the families quietly holding each other together in houses just like that one, across Millport, across the whole country. largely unnoticed by anybody until a crisis forced the world to finally look their way. It was exactly the kind of family Ellen would have wanted him to protect, without needing to be asked twice. He thought about how many times over the years he'd signed off on corporate policies without ever picturing a face behind them. A suspension clause here, a scheduling change there. Decisions that looked reasonable enough on paper but landed differently on somebody living paycheck to paycheck with a sick parent to care for. It was easy, Roy realized, to run a company well on numbers alone and still fail the people those numbers were supposed to represent. Roy had built rules into his company for a reason. Rules protected people, usually. But rules written by lawyers didn't know Nora Whitfield's name, didn't know about her father-in-law, didn't know the difference between a woman caught in someone else's scheme and someone who'd built the scheme herself. That difference mattered to Roy more than any clause ever could. That night, once the restaurant had gone dark and the last delivery truck had rolled out of the lot, Roy returned with Otis to the small back office where the paper ledgers were kept. This time, nobody needed to hide. Nobody needed an excuse about mopping floors. Otis flipped on the desk lamp, casting a small circle of yellow light over the drawer where the ledgers sat. "You said you found discrepancy," Roy said, pulling a chair up to the desk. "Walk me through everything. Don't leave anything out because you think it's small." Small is usually where the truth hides. Otis nodded, and for the next 2 hours, the two men went through 3 months of records line by line. The pattern Roy had glimpsed days earlier came into sharper focus now. With Otis's insider knowledge filling gaps Roy couldn't have filled alone. Comped meals ran nearly 4 times higher than any comparable location in the chain. Spoilage write-offs matched almost perfectly with weeks when delivery invoices showed shortages nobody had flagged at the loading dock. Every single discrepancy, without exception, got logged under either Nora's shift number or a generic staff error, code that traced back to no one in particular. "That's not sloppy bookkeeping," Roy said, tapping a column of figures. "That's deliberate. Somebody built this pattern on purpose." "Curtis isn't smart enough for this," Otis said. "Man can barely balance his own register some nights. This took planning. Patience. Which means either somebody's helping him," Roy said, "or somebody's using him without him fully understanding what he's part of." Otis flipped back several pages, frowning at something. Here, delivery invoice from 6 weeks back. Chicken order, 40 cases, signed for by Curtis. But the actual case count logged into inventory that same week only shows 32, 8 cases missing. Nobody questioned it. Marked as delivery shortage, vendor notified. Except, Otis pulled a second folder from the drawer, thin, nearly hidden behind thicker binders. "I kept my own notes. Wasn't sure what I was looking at until tonight, honestly. But our produce vendor called me directly about 2 months ago, confused. Said Curtis had asked them to start splitting invoices into 2 smaller deliveries per week instead of 1 large one." "Why would he want that?" "Smaller invoices," Otis said slowly, working it out as he spoke, "are easier to quietly shrink without anybody at corporate noticing a big jump in cost. Shave a little off 10 invoices instead of 1, it barely shows up as a blip in any single report." Roy sat back, rubbing a hand across his jaw, feeling older suddenly than he had that morning. That's not the mind of a man protecting his margins. That's the mind of a man laundering something. Or funneling something out, funneling to where? Roy stood and walked to the small window overlooking the parking lot, watching rain pool in the gravel where Curtis's car had been parked hours earlier. He didn't have an answer yet. "I want every discrepancy dated and cross-referenced against Nora's actual shift schedule," Roy said. "If even one of these so-called errors happened on a day she wasn't working, that alone proves the whole pattern is fabricated." Otis nodded, already flipping pages, cross-checking dates against a battered schedule binder pulled from a shelf behind the desk. 20 minutes later, he looked up. "Here, March 14th, registered discrepancy of $210, logged under Nora's employee code, and she wasn't here that day, called in sick. I remember because I covered 2 of her tables myself that afternoon." Roy felt something settle inside him, cold and certain. Not surprise exactly. Confirmation, print that page. "That's the first piece of proof strong enough to hand a lawyer. We'll need Curtis's phone next," Roy said. "Not to steal it. To ask him formally, as part of the internal review, to hand over any business communications relevant to vendor relationships. It's standard procedure. He can't refuse without raising more suspicion than he's already raised." Otis studied Roy a long moment. "You've done this before. Investigations like this." "Not exactly like this," Roy admitted. "But the Army taught me how to follow a trail nobody wants found. Some skills don't retire when you do. 40 years cooking eggs. And I never once figured you for a man who used to hunt down truth for a living. Didn't figure it myself most days, Roy said quietly. Some skills just wait around until you need them again. Otis closed the ledger folder and leaned back, studying Roy in the lamplight. Can I say something, and you not take it wrong? Go ahead. You built 14 restaurants, own more money than most men in this county will ever see in their lives. But you're sitting here at midnight in a back office, going through invoices like a man who's got something to prove. Roy considered that a long moment. Maybe I do. Ellen used to say I never really believed I deserved any of this. Grew up with nothing. Came home from the army with less than nothing. Some ways of looking at it. Every bit of success since then has felt like it could disappear if I stopped paying close enough attention. That's a heavy way to live, it is, Roy admitted. But it's probably why this place is still standing when a lot of restaurants from those years folded a long time ago. I never stopped paying attention. Until I did, apparently, long enough for somebody like Curtis to take advantage of it. Otis nodded loosely. Well, you're paying attention now. Damn right I am, Roy said, and reached for the next folder in the drawer. They worked in near silence for a while after that, the only sound the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of Otis shifting in his chair. Roy found himself thinking, somewhere in the middle of it, about how strange it was to be back at this exact desk after all these years, doing the same kind of careful, patient work he used to do when the whole company was just this one location and a hopeful young couple with $200 between them. You ever think about retiring? Otis asked at one point, not looking up from the ledger in front of him. Every year around this time, Roy admitted. Then something like this happens, and I remember why I haven't yet. What's that? 'Cause somebody's got to make sure the people actually doing the work get treated the way they deserve, Roy said. Spreadsheets don't do that on their own. Never have. Otis grunted in something like agreement and turned back to his page. My wife used to say the same thing about hospitals, he said after a moment. Charts and numbers can tell you a patient's vitals. Can't tell you whether anybody actually sat with them and held their hand. Roy looked up at that, something passing between the two men, unspoken but understood. She sounds like she was a wise woman, Roy said quietly. Wisest I ever knew, Otis said, and left it there. They worked another hour past midnight, building the case page by careful page, until the drawer finally sat empty, and the full shape of what had happened at Millport lay spread across the desks between them, undeniable, waiting only for the last piece to make sense of why. Denise Ferris arrived from Columbus in person the next morning, files in hand, along with a junior compliance officer to formally request Curtis's work devices as part of the active review. Roy had known Denise long enough to trust her judgment on nearly everything, and long enough to know she never raised her voice, even when the situation called for it. She'd handled harder things than this over the years. Wrongful termination suits, a health code violation that nearly shut down the Cincinnati location, a supplier lawsuit that dragged on for the better part of 2 years. She approached each one the same way, calm, thorough, unshakable. Curtis resisted at first, citing privacy, citing his rights, citing anything he could think of, standing in the parking lot of the motel where corporate had asked him to remain during the review. You had a lawyer present when you tampered with those ledgers? Denise asked him, calm as still water. Because if not, I'd think carefully before turning this into something bigger than it already is. I want it on record I'm cooperating under protest, Curtis said, voice rising. Everything I did because corporate kept squeezing margins tighter every quarter. Nobody at headquarters ever asked how I was supposed to hit those numbers. Just told me to hit them. Squeezing margins doesn't require framing an innocent employee for theft, Denise said. That was a choice. Yours alone as far as the evidence shows so far. Curtis's face reddened, but he had no answer for that. His resolve cracked within the hour. Faced with corporate counsel and a signed internal policy document, he eventually surrendered his phone, jaw clenched, eyes darting like a man calculating how much damage was already done. It took the compliance officer less than an hour to find it. A string of text messages, buried in a thread saved under a contact labeled simply W. Roy read them standing in the small office, Otis and Denise on either side of him. The rain outside finally letting up for the first time in 2 days. The messages spanned nearly a year. Vague at first, almost coded, the kind of language two people use when they both already understand what's really being discussed. Numbers still soft this quarter. Keep the pressure steady then over time, more direct, more confident, as if the sender had grown comfortable enough to stop worrying about who might eventually read them. Corporates watching margins closer than usual. Might need to slow down for a few weeks. And finally, 3 weeks back, a message that made Roy's stomach turn cold. Once she's gone and the review clears, location value drops enough to justify the sale. Stay patient. Almost there, Ratchi, Denise said quietly, reading over Roy's shoulder. That's Nora. Location values you drops enough to justify sale, Roy repeated. Somebody's not just skimming money. Somebody wants this restaurant devalued enough that corporate decides to sell it. To who? Otis asked, was already flipping through her own files. Roy, there's something you should know. Richard flagged this location for the divestiture list 11 months ago. Said the numbers had been trending down steadily, recommended selling before it dragged down chain-wide averages. Roy felt a small, uneasy twist in his gut. Richard's my son-in-law. He wouldn't do something like this. I'm not saying he would, Denise said carefully. I'm saying somebody may have been feeding him bad numbers for almost a year, and he had no way of knowing they were manufactured. Roy nodded slowly, filing that thought away, unwilling yet to follow it all the way to its uncomfortable end. Richard had always struck him as careful, if anything, the kind of man who double-checked everything twice before signing his name to it. That carefulness, Roy realized now, could just as easily become a weakness in the hands of somebody patient enough to feed him exactly the numbers he expected to see. That afternoon, once Denise and her team had left to process the phone records through proper legal channels, Roy called his daughter. Sarah, Dad, is everything okay? Richard said something happened at Millport. Everything's under control, Roy said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true yet. How's Richard been the past few months? Stressed, maybe? Sarah hesitated. He's been stressed for almost a year, actually. Working late, constantly. Says the Millport numbers have been giving him headaches, trying to figure out why a flagship location keeps underperforming no matter what he tries. I've been worried about him, honestly. He's not sleeping well. Has he mentioned who's been feeding him those numbers? Curtis, I assume. Why, Dad? What's going on? I'll explain everything soon, Roy said. Just tell me one thing. Has Richard mentioned any new business contacts lately? Anybody reaching out to him about consulting or restructuring? A longer pause this time. There's a consultant he's been talking to for months, said the man. Reached out directly, offered free advice on restructuring underperforming locations. Richard seemed relieved. Somebody was finally helping him figure out the Millport problem. Said it felt like a weight off his shoulders. Honestly, having someone else who understood the numbers as well as he did. Do you happen to know his name? I don't, actually. Richard's only ever mentioned him in passing, usually late at night when he got home from another long call with the man. Why does it matter? Might matter a great deal, Roy said. Just don't let Richard sign anything final regarding Millport until I've had a chance to talk to him myself. Can you promise me that? Okay, I promise. But Dad, please tell me you're not about to do something reckless. I'm just going to have an old conversation that's overdue, Roy said. Nothing reckless about that. He hung up and stood a long moment in the quiet office, understanding now that whoever was behind this hadn't attacked the restaurant from the outside alone. They'd found their way in through Richard, through trust, through the kind of charm that could talk its way past a careful man's better judgment. Roy scrolled further back through Curtis's message thread, searching for any identifying detail that might reveal who W actually was. He found it near the very beginning, over a year old, easy to miss unless you were looking hard. A single message, sent from Curtis to the mystery contact, read, "Good seeing you at the rally last month. Small world, ending up working the same territory again after all these years rally." Roy's chest tightened. Otis, he said quietly, pull up whatever motorcycle rally schedules you can find from around 14 months ago. Regional stuff, veteran clubs, anything in a 100-mile radius of here. Otis frowned but didn't ask why. He pulled out his own phone and started searching. Denise glanced between the two men. You know who this is? I might, Roy said. Give me tonight to be sure before I say a name I haven't spoken out loud in 20 years. That night, Roy sat alone in his motel room. Curtis's message thread already photographed and forwarded to Denise for the formal file, but a copy saved on his own phone too, because some things a man needs to look at himself more than once before he believes them. He scrolled the contact thread again. W. Nothing more specific. No last name. No phone number visible beyond a series of digits that trace back to a prepaid burner. According to the quick check Denise's team had already run, careful. Whoever this was, they were careful. Roy thought back through every motorcycle rally he could remember from roughly 14 months ago. Regional gatherings, charity rides, the kind of events his old club, the veterans riders, still attended a few times a year, raising money for military families, keeping old friendships alive. One name kept surfacing in his memory. Unwanted, unwelcome, like a splinter working its way back to the surface of skin that had healed over it years ago. Wesley Malone. They used to call him Wrench, back when he rode with Roy's club nearly 2 decades earlier. Good mechanic, better talker. The kind of man who could charm a room full of strangers into trusting him within 20 minutes. Roy remembered the early years before any of it went bad. Wesley showing up to his first club meeting on a bike he'd rebuilt himself from a junkyard frame, grinning like a man who couldn't believe his luck at being let inside the door. He'd worked harder than anybody to earn his place in those first couple years, showing up early to every charity ride, staying late to help strand riders on the highway, the kind of member other clubs wished they had. Roy had liked him then, had trusted him with things that mattered. That trust was exactly why the club had put Wesley in charge of the Gold Star Families Fund, a small charity the veterans riders ran to help cover funeral costs and emergency expenses for families of servicemen who never made it home. Wesley managed that fund for 6 years, by all appearances faithfully, until an audit, prompted by nothing more than routine bookkeeping curiosity, discovered nearly $40,000 had gone missing from accounts nobody could fully trace. Money meant for grieving widows. Gone, spent on things nobody in the club ever saw a receipt for, hidden behind excuses that grew thinner every time Wesley was asked to explain them. Roy had been the one to formally expel him, stood in front of the whole club at Wesley's own request for a hearing, and voted alongside the others to strip him of his patch, his membership, his place among men who'd once called him brother. Wesley never forgave him for it. Roy remembered the look on his face that night, 20 years ago now, a look that promised this wasn't over, no matter how many years passed. "You'll regret this, Callahan," Wesley had said, quiet enough that only Roy heard it as he walked out the door for the last time. "Man like you, always so sure he's got the moral high ground. One day you'll understand what it costs to lose everything over one mistake." Roy had never considered it one mistake. $40,000 stolen from grieving families wasn't a mistake. It was a choice repeated over and over for years by a man who'd decided his own comfort mattered more than the promises he'd made. Roy set the phone down on the motel nightstand, staring at the water-stained ceiling above him, rain finally quiet outside for the first time in 2 days. If Wesley Malone was behind this, it wasn't really about money anymore. Wesley had plenty of other ways to make money by now, if his reputation among certain circles was anything to go by. This was about something older, something personal. This was about a debt Wesley believed Roy owed him, one he'd apparently decided to collect by destroying the one restaurant that carried Roy's wife's name. Roy closed his eyes a long moment, exhaustion and anger sitting side by side in his chest, the same uneasy neighbors they'd been since that slap landed across his cheek 2 days ago. He thought about the Gold Star families Wesley had once betrayed, families Roy had personally driven checks out to, sitting in living rooms holding hands with widows who trusted the club to keep its word when the paperwork got tangled up. He thought about Nora doing that same quiet, unglamorous work of holding a family together, and how close she'd come to being sacrificed by a man carrying out somebody else's 20-year grudge. There was a strange symmetry to it, Roy thought, lying there in the dark. Wesley had once been trusted to protect grieving families, and had instead robbed them. Now he was trying to destroy the one place that had spent nearly 3 decades quietly doing the opposite, looking after the people who walked through its doors, whether they realized it or not. 72 hours had already become something else entirely. Whatever time remained now belonged to a fight that stretched back 2 decades, into a past Roy had thought was finally settled. He picked up his phone one more time and typed a short message to Otis. "Need you to help me find an old friend tomorrow. One who forgot how to be a friend a long time ago." Otis wrote back within a minute, "Whatever you need. Some debts take a while to come due." Roy set the phone down and lay back against the motel pillow, listening to the last of the rain finally trickle to silence outside. He thought about the last time he'd seen Wesley in person, 20 years ago, walking out of that clubhouse into a parking lot, much like the one outside Millport, engine starting, taillight disappearing down the road without a backward glance. Roy had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that disappearing was the same as being finished. He understood now that some men don't disappear. They simply wait, patient as rust, for an opening wide enough to walk back through. He thought about the version of himself that had stood in front of the club that night 20 years ago. Certain he was doing the right thing. never once imagining the cost of that rightness might still be collecting interest 2 decades later. 20 years was a long time to carry a grudge. It was an equally long time to assume one had quietly faded away, simply because nobody spoke of it anymore. Outside the motel window, the clouds finally broke, and somewhere far off toward Millport, a sliver of moonlight touched the water tower with Roy's initials still faintly visible on its side. A small, quiet reminder of a man who'd built something worth protecting, and now had to decide exactly how far he was willing to go to protect it. Tomorrow, he would need to find Wesley. Tomorrow, he would need to sit across from Richard and ask him, gently but firmly, exactly how deep this consultant relationship had gone. Tomorrow, whatever time remained, would need to move fast. But tonight, for just a little while longer, Roy allowed himself to simply lie still, listening to silence where rain had been, and remember that even in the middle of an old wound reopening some things, a promise kept, a good woman protected, a kitchen finally told the truth, still counted for something. Richard Coleman drove out from Columbus the next morning, 3 hours earlier than Roy had asked him to come, which told Roy something about how little sleep his son-in-law had gotten the night before. Roy had known Richard for 6 years now, ever since Sarah brought him home for a Sunday dinner, and Roy had watched the young man's hands shake slightly passing the mashed potatoes, nervous in a way Roy found more endearing than off-putting. Richard had grown up in Columbus, an only child of 2 school teachers, and had come into the restaurant business through an MBA program rather than through years of standing over a grill the way Roy had. Good with numbers, careful with decisions. Roy had always respected that about him, even when their working styles clashed on smaller matters. They met at the Millport location, in the small office that still smelled faintly of old coffee, and the ledgers that had sat untouched for years before this week. Richard looked exhausted. Tie loosened, collar wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there at Thanksgiving dinner 6 months back. "Sarah told me you've been asking about a consultant," Richard said, sitting down heavily across from Roy. "I need you to understand something before you say whatever it is you're about to say. I never authorized anything improper. I was just trying to fix a problem nobody else seemed able to explain." "I believe you," Roy said, and watched some of the tension drain from Richard's shoulders. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything, son. I'm here because I think you got used by somebody very good at using people." Richard's jaw tightened. "His name is Wesley Malone, freelance restaurant consultant, or so his website says. Reached out to me about 14 months ago, said he'd heard about our struggles at Millport through industry contacts. Offered to help pro bono at first, just to build a relationship. And you trusted him. He knew things," Richard said, frustration edging into his voice. "Real things about the restaurant business. Talked me through margin analysis better than half the consultants we pay real money to. Said he used to run his own chain years back, lost it in a partnership dispute. Wanted to help other operators avoid his mistakes." Roy nodded slowly. That story tracked with what he knew of Wesley. The man had always been able to dress a lie up in just enough truth to make it breathe on its own. "He ever ask for money directly?" Roy asked. "Consulting fees, retainers, anything like that?" "Never took a dime," Richard said. "That's what made him seem trustworthy. Said he was doing it as a professional courtesy, building relationships in the industry, hoping to land bigger contracts down the road once operators saw the results." "Classic," Roy muttered. "Man never needed your money directly. He needed your trust, and your trust was worth more to his plan than any consulting fee could have been." Richard rubbed his temples, looking older than his 34 years in that moment. "I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," Roy said. "You're a man who trusted someone who spent 20 years perfecting exactly how to earn trust he didn't deserve. That's not foolishness, son. That's just what a good con looks like from the inside." "Did he ever mention me directly? My history? The motorcycle club?" Richard's face shifted, something clicking into place behind his eyes. "Once, early on. Said he used to ride with veterans clubs himself. Mentioned yours by name, actually. Said he respected the work you'd done for military families over the years. He was studying you," Roy said quietly, "learning exactly how to get close enough to steer decisions without ever raising suspicion." "Steer decisions toward what?" "Toward selling Millport," Roy said, "at the lowest possible valuation. To a buyer Wesley's almost certainly connected to, though we haven't confirmed that piece yet." Richard sat back, stunned. "I recommended the divestiture list based on numbers he helped me analyze. If those numbers were manufactured, they were," Roy said. "Curtis has been quietly cooking the books here for the better part of a year, based on guidance he was receiving from Wesley directly. Every dollar of manufactured loss, every suspicious write-off, was designed to make this location look like dead weight on paper. Richard put his head in his hands for a long moment. I almost sold your restaurant, Roy. Ellen's restaurant, based on advice from a man who was actively trying to destroy it. You didn't know, Roy said. That's the whole point of a con this well-built. It's designed so the man being used never sees the strings. Richard looked up, eyes red-rimmed. How do we fix this? We stop the divestiture vote, Roy said, effective immediately. And then we find Wesley Malone, and we make sure whatever he thought he was going to collect from the scheme, he collects instead a very different kind of reckoning. What kind? The kind that happens in daylight, Roy said, with witnesses, with evidence, not the kind that happens in a parking lot at midnight, which is honestly what part of me wants right now. Richard almost managed a small, exhausted laugh at that. You're angrier than I've ever seen you. I've had 20 years to sit with this particular anger, Roy said. Man tried to destroy something my wife built with her own hands, using her own money, believing in a promise I made her before she died. That kind of anger doesn't need managing. It needs directing. Richard nodded slowly, straightening in his chair, something like resolve settling back into his posture. Tell me what you need me to do. First thing, Roy said, call Denise. Get every scrap of correspondence you have with Wesley pulled together for the legal file. Second thing, help me find out exactly where he's operating from these days. 20 years is a long time to disappear, but men like Wesley leave trails if you know how to look. Richard pulled out his laptop immediately, scrolling through old emails, old invoices, anything bearing Wesley's contact information. Here, Richard said after a few minutes. He operates a small consulting firm registered out of Dayton. Malone Restaurant Advisory. Business address is a UPS store, but there's a cell number on the letterhead. Roy took down the number, feeling something cold and steady settle into his chest, the same feeling he used to get before difficult missions decades ago, when there was no longer any question about what needed to happen next, only the matter of doing it right. One more thing, Richard said, hesitating. He asked me once, early on, whether you and I got along, whether there was any tension between us, father-in-law to son-in-law. I thought it was just friendly conversation at the time. Roy felt a fresh wave of understanding settle over him. He was looking for a crack to widen, somewhere he could plant doubt between us if he needed to. I told him we got along fine, Richard said. Guess that didn't give him much to work with. No, Roy said. Guess it didn't. That's one thing he miscalculated at least. There's something else, Richard added, scrolling further. He sent me a market analysis about 6 months ago, listing 3 other locations he thought might be worth evaluating for sale. 2 belonged to competitors. One's a location up in Toledo, part of our chain, that I'd actually started quietly looking into before all this came out. Roy felt his stomach tighten. Send that analysis to Denise immediately. If Wesley's been running this same play on multiple locations, we need to know the full scope before this goes any further. You think he's done this to other companies too? Man like Wesley doesn't build one scheme and stop, Roy said. Takes too much patience to build something like this. He'd have wanted more than one target, insurance in case one plan fell through before it paid off. Richard's face paled slightly at the implication. I'll have Denise cross-reference every location on his list against recent divestiture recommendations company-wide. Good, Roy said. This might be bigger than just Millport before we're finished untangling it. You stay here, work with Denise, make sure everything gets documented the right way. Otis and I will handle the next part. Richard nodded, already dialing Denise's number, and Roy walked out into the gray Ohio morning, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind, heading toward whatever conversation waited for him 20 years overdue. The address Richard found led to a squat cinderblock building on the outskirts of Dayton, a motorcycle repair shop with a faded sign reading Malone Sickle and Consulting, half the letters peeling from years of weather. Roy and Otis pulled up in Roy's pickup a little after noon, gravel crunching under the tires. Neither man had spoken much during the hour-long drive, both turning over their own private thoughts about what waited on the other side of that garage door. You want me to stay in the truck? Otis asked as Roy shut off the engine. No, Roy said. I want a witness. Somebody who knew me before all this, who can tell me straight afterward if I handled it the way Ellen would have wanted me to handle it. Otis nodded and followed him out. Through the open garage bay, Roy's man bent over a bike engine, gray creeping into hair that used to be jet black, but the build was unmistakable. Same broad shoulders, same easy, confident stance, even hunched over a workbench. Wesley looked up as the truck door slammed. Recognition crossed his face instantly. followed by something that almost looked like relief, like a man finally exhaling after holding his breath for 20 years. "Callahan," Wesley said, setting down his wrench slowly. "Took you long enough, Wesley. I figured you'd come eventually. Just took longer than I expected. Guess retirement's made you slower than you used to be. Or maybe I just wanted to be sure," Roy said, "before I drove out here and said something I couldn't take back." Wesley wiped his hands on a rag, unhurried, studying Roy like a man appraising an old rival across a chessboard. "So you figured out it was me. Took you a whole week. I'm almost disappointed. Expected the great Roy Callahan to move a little faster." "Why, Wesley?" 20 years, and this is how you spend it. Building a scheme to ruin a restaurant that never did anything to you, never did anything to me?" Wesley's calm cracked slightly, old bitterness surfacing fast. "You stood in front of the whole club and stripped everything from me. My patch, my brothers, my name in that community, gone overnight, because of one accounting dispute you decided to make an example out of. $40,000 stolen from grieving families isn't an accounting dispute," Roy said, voice steady but hard. "You know that as well as I do. I paid every dollar of that back," Wesley snapped. "Took me 6 years, working double shifts, but I paid it back in full. Nobody ever acknowledged that. Nobody welcomed me back. You made sure of that. Paying it back after getting caught isn't the same as never taking it," Roy said. "And you're right that I never welcomed you back. Trust, once it's broken with families who buried their sons, doesn't get rebuilt just because a debt gets repaid on a schedule. Some things stay broken, Wesley. That's a hard truth, but it's a true one. Easy for you to say. You never lost anything. Never had a whole community turn its back on you overnight. I lost a wife," Roy said quietly. "Watched her die slow over 6 months, holding her hand every night, promising her I'd protect the one thing she built with her own 2 hands. That's a different kind of loss than losing a motorcycle patch, Wesley, and I'd think twice before comparing the two in front of me." Wesley's face flickered, something like genuine shame crossing it for just a moment before hardening back into old resentment. "You destroyed my life over one mistake," Wesley said, "so I figured it was time you understood what that feels like. Watch something you built with your own hands get taken away, piece by piece, and know there's nothing you can do to stop it." "Except there was something I could do," Roy said. "There's always something. That's the whole difference between us, Wesley. When I found out something was wrong, I put on an apron and went looking for the truth myself. When you found out you'd been caught, you built an elaborate scheme instead of just owning what you'd done." Otis stood quietly a few steps behind Roy, watching, saying nothing, letting this conversation belong entirely to the 2 men who'd carried it for 2 decades. "It's over, Wesley," Roy continued. "Curtis has already been cut loose from this company. Every text message between the 2 of you is documented, cataloged, and sitting in a legal file back in Columbus. Richard's already stopped the divestiture vote. Whatever you thought you were going to gain from destroying that restaurant, it's not happening." Wesley's face went through several emotions in quick succession: anger, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like exhaustion. "What now, then?" Wesley asked. "You going to have me arrested? Sue me into the ground? That's up to the lawyers and whatever laws you actually broke," Roy said. "Fraud, extortion, conspiracy. Denise will sort out exactly which charges apply. That's not my decision to make alone anymore, and if I disappear before any of that happens, then you disappear a coward on top of everything else," Roy said. "But I don't think that's who you actually want to be, deep down. I think some part of you has been waiting 20 years for somebody to finally make you answer for something. This is that moment, Wesley. What you do with it says more about you now than anything that happened back then." Wesley stood silent, a long moment, workshop quiet except for the distant hum of a compressor somewhere in the back. "I love that club," Wesley finally said, quieter now, some of the old bitterness draining out of his voice. "Whatever else I did wrong, I loved those brothers. Losing that hurt worse than anything, worse than I think I ever let myself admit, even to myself." Roy studied him a moment, remembering the young man who'd shown up on a junkyard bike 2 decades ago, grinning like he couldn't believe his luck. Somewhere between that man and the one standing in front of him now, something had curdled, slow and quiet, until bitterness became the only fuel left driving him forward. He thought about how easily that curdling could happen to any man left alone too long with a grievance. Nobody around to challenge the story he told himself about it. The wound getting a little more infected with each passing year instead of healing the way it should have. "You had a chance to make it right a long time ago," Roy said. "Could have come to the club, apologized properly, asked what it would take to earn back even a shred of trust. Instead, you disappeared for 20 years and spent that whole time building a plan to hurt people who had nothing to do with what happened between us. Would it have mattered? Wesley asked, something almost desperate in his voice now. Would you have let me back in if I'd asked properly? Roy considered the question honestly, refusing to give an easy answer just to end the conversation faster. I don't know, he admitted. Might not have, but you never gave either of us the chance to find out. And that's on you, not me. Wesley absorbed that, jaw working silently, old anger finally seeming to run its course, leaving something quieter and more tired in its place. Then here's your chance to finally be honest about all of it, Roy said. Not to me, to the people you actually hurt. Nora Whitfield included, a woman who almost lost her livelihood because of a grudge that had nothing to do with her. Wesley's eyes flickered with something that might have been genuine remorse, or might simply have been a man recognizing the game was finally over. Roy couldn't be entirely sure which, and honestly, he thought, it probably didn't matter anymore. The truth would come out either way, in whatever room it needed to come out in. I'll cooperate, Wesley said finally. Full statement. Whatever Denise needs, good, Roy said and turned to leave, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 20 years. Not quite forgiveness, but something adjacent to it. Something that at least allowed him to breathe easier walking back to the truck. Back at the restaurant that evening, with Wesley's cooperation secured and Denise's team building the final case file, Rawls sat in booth 4 with Otis, 2 cups of coffee between them, the dining room otherwise empty and quiet. There's something I never told you, Otis said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. About that first phone call, the one that got you down here in the first place. Roy looked up. What about it? It was me, Otis said. I made that call. Roy sat back slightly, surprised despite everything else that had come to light this week. You disguised your voice. Wasn't sure you'd believe me otherwise, Otis said. Wasn't sure you'd believe an aging line cook over your own son-in-law's spreadsheets, if I'm honest. Figured an anonymous tip might carry more weight than my name attached to it. Why didn't you just tell me directly? Come to Columbus, sit me down, explain what you'd noticed. Otis was quiet a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I've been watching this happen for almost a year, Roy. Watching Curtis squeeze Nora tighter every month. Watching inventory disappear. And every time I thought about speaking up, I talked myself out of it. Why? Because I'm 61 years old, Otis said. Because this job is the only steady paycheck I've got left in me at this point in my life. Because I told myself somebody else would notice eventually, somebody with more to lose than I had left to give. I let fear talk me into silence for longer than I'm proud of. Roy waited, sensing there was more underneath that answer. My wife passed 4 years back, Otis continued. Quieter now. Cancer, same as Ellen. This job's the only thing that's kept me steady since then. Waking up, coming in, standing at that grill. It gives my days a shape they wouldn't otherwise have. I was scared that speaking up too loud might cost me the one thing still holding me together most mornings. Roy felt something shift in his chest, a recognition passing between 2 men who'd carried similar weight without ever fully discussing it before now. I didn't know that, Roy said quietly. About your wife. Didn't figure it was relevant to a job interview, Otis said, allowing himself a small, tired smile, but it's relevant to why I stayed quiet so long. Grief makes a man cautious in ways he doesn't always recognize in himself. Not until somebody else forces the mirror up in front of him. What was her name? Roy asked. If you don't mind me asking, Loretta, Otis said, something warm crossing his face at the sound of it. 31 years married. She used to say I made the best eggs in Ohio, though I suspect she was a little biased on that particular point. Sounds like she had good taste regardless, Roy said. Otis chuckled, the sound low and genuine. She'd have liked you, I think. Would have told me to stop being so stubborn about speaking up sooner. She never had much patience for silence when silence was doing more harm than good. Roy studied his old friend a long moment. But you called eventually, because it got to be too much, Otis said. Watching Nora cry in the walk-in cooler after a shift thinking nobody could see her. Watching Curtis threaten her job over a comp dessert that cost this place $11. Something in me finally said enough, and I made that call before I could talk myself out of it again. I'm glad you did, Roy said. I should have done it sooner, Otis said. Should have said something the first time I noticed inventory numbers looking wrong, months before any of this got as bad as it got. I carry that. Probably will for a while. Roy leaned forward, elbows on the table. Otis, listen to me. You did something a lot of people never managed to do. You found your courage eventually, even after being scared for a long stretch of time. That matters more than exactly when it happened. Feels like it should have mattered sooner. It always feels that way, Roy said. I spent 8 years letting a clock in my hallway sit broken, telling myself I couldn't fix it because fixing it felt like moving on from Ellen too fast. Only realized this week that letting something stay broken isn't the same as honoring what it once meant. Sometimes it's just fear, dressed up as respect. Otis absorbed that a moment, nodding slowly. You gonna fix that clock now? Planning on it, Roy said. Tonight, actually, once I get home. Good, Otis said. About time, old friend. They sat quiet a while longer, coffee cooling between them, the restaurant settling into the particular stillness that comes after a long, hard week, when the worst of a storm has finally passed, but the cleanup still stretches ahead. What happens to Curtis now? Otis finally asked. Formal termination, effective today, Roy said. Denise is also reviewing whether criminal charges apply. That's not really my call anymore either. That's a matter for the law now. And Nora? Roy allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first one in days. That conversation, I get to have myself. Tomorrow morning if you want to be there for it. Wouldn't miss it, Otis said. The next morning, Roy called every former Millport employee back to the restaurant. One final all-staff meeting before the doors would reopen for business under new management. They filed in slowly, uncertain faces from a week earlier now carrying something closer to cautious hope. Denise stood near the counter, files organized and ready. Richard stood beside her, having driven back down from Columbus at Roy's request, looking steadier than he had in days. Otis stood near the kitchen door in his apron, having come in early to start prepping breakfast for the meeting, wanting everyone to smell something familiar and warm in the air while they waited to hear their fate. Roy stood in the same spot he'd stood a week ago, when the slap still burned fresh on his cheek and none of them understood yet who he really was. I owe every one of you an update, Roy began, and an apology. For putting you through a week of uncertainty that wasn't your fault to carry. He explained it plainly, without unnecessary detail, the way a man explains hard truths to people who deserve honesty more than drama. Curtis had been formally terminated, effective immediately, and would face further consequences, determined by legal review. The scheme behind the restaurant's troubles had been fully uncovered, traced back to an outside party with a personal grudge against Roy himself, unrelated to anything the staff had done. Every one of you is cleared, Roy said. Full reinstatement, full back pay for the suspension period, and my personal commitment that this location isn't going anywhere, isn't being sold, isn't being folded into anything else. It stays exactly what it's always been. A ripple of relief moved through the group, quiet at first, then breaking into soft applause, a few employees hugging each other, Patty wiping her eyes with a corner of her apron. Deshawn spoke up from near the back. What about a new manager? Somebody coming in from outside? Or, that's actually the next thing I want to announce, Roy said, and looked toward Nora, who stood near the middle of the group, unsuspecting. Once I've had a chance to speak with her privately first, a few knowing glances passed among the staff, quiet smiles forming, several of them clearly already guessing what was coming. Patty raised her hand hesitantly. Mr. Callahan, will there be any changes to how schedules work? Some of us have been asking for more consistent hours for a while now, but Curtis never seemed interested in listening. That's a fair question, Roy said. And yes, corporate's implementing a review of scheduling practices across every location, not just Millport, starting this month. I should have made that a priority years ago, instead of assuming things were running fairly on their own. A murmur of approval moved through the group at that. Several employees exchanging surprised, hopeful glances. Deshawn spoke up again. For what it's worth, Mr. Callahan, I think most of us would have stood up for Nora sooner if we'd known how bad Curtis was really making it for her behind closed doors. She never let on how much she was carrying. That's exactly the kind of person she is, Roy said, which is part of why what happens next matters so much to me. Roy dismissed the group with instructions to report back the following Monday, full pay restored, positions fully secured, and watched them file out into the parking lot, lighter on their feet than they'd been walking in. He found Nora near the back of the group and asked her to stay behind after the others left. Once the dining room emptied, Roy sat across from her in booth 4, the same booth where he'd once sat with Ellen every Sunday, the same booth where he'd sat alone just days ago, wrestling with everything this week had uncovered. I owe you more than an apology, Roy said. I owe you an explanation for why this happened to you specifically, and a promise about what happens next. He told her the full truth about Wesley, about the 20-year-old grudge, about how her honesty and diligence had made her an easy target for a man trying to make an example out of the one location Roy cared about most. Nora listened quietly, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, absorbing a story far larger than she'd ever imagined being caught inside of. "So none of it was ever really about me," she said slowly, working through it. "I was just convenient. The easiest person to blame because I didn't have the resources to fight back. That's the ugly truth of it," Roy said. "But I want you to hear the other side of that same truth. You were targeted because you were the one person paying close enough attention to threaten the scheme. That's not weakness, Nora. That's exactly the kind of integrity. Most people don't have the backbone to maintain under pressure." She considered that, something shifting in her posture, straightening slightly. "I want to offer you the general manager position here," Roy said, once he'd finished. "Full authority, full support from corporate, and my personal word that nobody will ever treat you the way Curtis did again, not while I have any say in how this company runs." Nora's eyes widened. "I don't have management experience, Mr. Callahan. You've got something better," Roy said. "You've got character that held steady under real pressure. I've watched enough managers over the years to know that experience can be taught. Character can't." She was quiet a long moment, clearly working through disbelief, exhaustion, and something like cautious hope all tangled together. "My father-in-law," she started. "I can't work extra hours right now, not with his care." "Then we build the schedule around that," Roy said simply. "This job should work for your life, not the other way around." That's a rule I should have enforced years ago, honestly, instead of just assuming core corporate would handle it fairly on its own. "What about training?" "I wouldn't know the first thing about payroll, ordering, scheduling. Otis has run this kitchen practically on his own for years," Roy said. "He'll help you learn the operational side faster than you'd expect. And Denise's team will handle a full management training program, paid over the next month, before you're expected to run things solo." Nora's composure finally cracked, just slightly, eyes shining with tears she didn't bother hiding this time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming back that first night, for believing me before you even had proof." "Character shows up clearest under pressure," Roy said, echoing words he'd said to her days before. "You showed me yours the very first day I walked into that kitchen. Wasn't hard to believe in you after that." She wiped her eyes, laughing a little through the tears now. "My father-in-law is going to be insufferable when I tell him. He's been saying for a year I deserve better than Curtis ever gave me credit for." "Sounds like a man worth listening to," Roy said. "Bring him by sometime. I'd like to shake his hand properly." Roy drove home that evening for the first time all week, back to the quiet house he'd left in the middle of the night, back to the garage where a half-disassembled motorcycle still waited exactly where he'd left it. He walked through the front door and stood in the hallway a long moment, looking at the old clock, frozen at 4:15, the same time Ellen had passed 8 years earlier. He thought about the day he'd first noticed it had stopped, sitting beside her hospital bed as the machines quieted and the room grew still, and how, driving home hours later in a daze, he'd walked past this same clock and simply left it as it was, telling himself he'd deal with it later, once the grief settled enough to think clearly. Later had stretched into 8 years. Sarah used to ask him about it every so often, gently, never pushing too hard. "It's just a clock, Dad," she'd said once, a couple years back, standing in that same hallway. He'd nodded and changed the subject, the way he always did, and she'd let it go, the way she always did. Both of them understanding, without saying it, that some things a person has to arrive at on their own timeline. He'd told himself for 8 years that fixing it felt like betraying her memory somehow, like moving on too fast, like letting go of something he wasn't ready to release. Friends had offered to fix it for him more than once. Sarah had offered gently, on more than one visit home. Roy had always declined, citing some vague sentiment about honoring the moment, though if he was honest with himself, sitting here now, he understood it had always been simpler and sadder than that. He'd been afraid that a working clock meant time continuing to move forward without her in it, and some part of him hadn't been ready to admit that time had, in fact, kept moving all along, whether he acknowledged it or not. This week had taught him something different. Letting something stay broken wasn't honoring a memory. Sometimes it was simply fear, dressed up in the clothing of respect, keeping a man frozen in a moment long after the moment itself needed him to keep moving. He found his toolbox in the hallway closet, unscrewed the clock's back panel carefully, and worked by lamplight for nearly an hour, cleaning old gears, replacing a worn spring, doing the kind of patient, careful work Ellen always said he was better at than he gave himself credit for. His hands remembered the motion even after all these years away from fine mechanical work. The same steady patience he'd once brought to rebuilding carburetors in that garage, the same patience he'd brought to holding Ellen's hand steady through 6 months of treatment, without ever letting her see how frightened he truly was underneath it. When he finally wound it and set it back on the wall, the second hand began ticking forward for the first time in 8 years. Roy stood there, watching it move, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. "There you go, Ellen," he said quietly to the empty house. "Kept the promise. Took me longer than it should have to remember that keeping it meant living, too, not just holding on." He sat down in his recliner that night and listened to the clock ticking steadily from the hallway, a sound he hadn't heard in this house in 8 years, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that it comforted him rather than unsettled him, the way he'd feared it might all this time. 3 weeks later, on a clear Saturday morning, nearly 40 motorcycles rolled down Main Street in Millport, engines rumbling low and steady, riders in leather vests marked with the patches of the Veterans Riders Club, on their way to the annual charity ride benefiting Gold Star families across the region. They stopped, as they always did, at Dalton's Diner for breakfast before the long ride ahead. The diner had changed in small but meaningful ways over those 3 weeks. A new sign hung in the kitchen, painted by hand rather than printed. The same 6 words Roy remembered from decades ago finally restored to their rightful place above the pass window. Nora had insisted on it herself. Once Roy told her the story behind it, saying every new hire deserved to walk in under those words on their very first day, the same way she wished she had. Nora stood at the door to greet the riders, apron crisp, name tag reading General Manager beneath her name, a title she still occasionally looked at with quiet disbelief. She'd completed her first 2 weeks of management training with a steadiness that surprised even Denise, who'd overseen dozens of manager transitions across the company and rarely saw anyone take to it quite so naturally. Otis worked the grill, humming something under his breath, flipping pancakes for riders who'd traveled from 3 states over. He'd taken to training 2 younger cooks that week. Patient in a way Roy suspected came easier to him, now that he'd finally unburdened himself of a year's worth of silent worry. Roy walked in last, off his own restored shovelhead, helmet under one arm, and took a seat in booth 4. The booth that had somehow become simply his again, the way it had been decades ago. Nora's father-in-law sat 2 booths over, wearing his old army cap, chatting easily with 2 other veterans from the club about units they'd served in, decades and different postings apart, finding the particular kind of common ground that only people who've carried similar weight ever really find with each other. He'd taken to visiting most Saturdays now, Nora driving him over herself before her shift began, and the regulars had started saving him the same corner booth without anyone needing to ask. Richard arrived partway through breakfast, having driven down from Columbus just to see the restaurant running steady again, and slid into the booth across from Roy. "Sarah wanted me to tell you thank you," Richard said, "for not holding what happened against me." "Wasn't your fault," Roy said. "Man like Wesley spent 20 years perfecting how to fool good people. You weren't the first, and unfortunately, you probably won't be the last, somewhere down the line. Doesn't make it feel less foolish. Feeling foolish sometimes just means you're paying attention now," Roy said. "That's worth more than never having been fooled at all, if you ask me." Richard managed a small laugh at that, some of the tension he'd carried the past 3 weeks finally easing from his shoulders. "Sarah says I've been better company at dinner since this all got resolved. Guess carrying that kind of guilt around does something to a man's mood." "Guilt's useful for a while," Roy said. "Tells you something matters. But it's not meant to move in permanently. Best to let it teach its lesson and then get out of the way." Richard nodded slowly, looking around the dining room, taking in details Roy suspected he'd never fully noticed on his occasional visits before. The booth colors Ellen had chosen, the framed opening day photo now rehung on the office wall, the particular warmth of a place built one careful decision at a time, rather than assembled from a corporate template. "I've been thinking," Richard said, "about adding a review step to how we evaluate underperforming locations going forward. Not just trusting whatever numbers land on my desk, but actually visiting, talking to staff directly, the way you did here." "That's a good instinct," Roy said. "Wish I'd had it myself. 20-some years running this business before I finally remembered to walk my own kitchen floor again. Better late than never, I suppose." "Story of most good lessons," Roy said, allowing himself a small smile. Denise's office had confirmed, 2 days earlier, that Wesley's full statement had been formally entered into the legal record, along with Curtis's, and that both men would face consequences appropriate to what investigators eventually determined about the scale of the fraud. Roy hadn't asked for details beyond that. Some things, once set in motion the right way, didn't need a man's personal oversight to see them through to their proper end. Outside, the line of motorcycles idled at the curb, chrome catching the morning sun, riders finishing their coffee before the long ride toward the small memorial, where they'd lay wreaths for families who'd lost more than most people could imagine. Roy looked around the dining room. Nora refilling coffee with steady hands, Otis calling out orders through the pass window, Richard laughing quietly at something Otis had just said. Riders and regulars mixing easily among the same booths. Ellen had painted harvest gold nearly 3 decades earlier. The old clock ticked steadily on the wall behind the register now. 4:15 long since passed, moving forward the same as everything else finally was. Roy thought about a sign that used to hang on this kitchen wall, one he'd had remade and rehung earlier that month. The same 6 words that had guided this place since the very beginning, the same words Nora had already started saying to new hires, without anyone needing to teach her. A good restaurant isn't the one with the best food. It's the one where nobody gets left alone in the kitchen outside, engines revved to life, one after another, and the veterans riders pulled out onto Main Street, heading toward the next stretch of road, carrying forward a promise that had somehow, after everything, finally found its way back to being kept. Roy stayed a moment longer than the others, watching the last of the motorcycles disappear around the bend before rising from booth 4, nodding to Nora on his way out, and walking toward his own bike parked at the curb, ready to fall in at the back of the line, exactly where a man who'd learned to lead by listening first had always belonged.